We are living in the final years of an era of freedom that many took for granted. As technology advances and economic policies shift, control over our finances is becoming increasingly centralized. The opportunities that once allowed generations to build stable lives are disappearing, while the threats to our right to control our own money are intensifying. In this video, we'll explore how the American dream has been eroded over recent decades, how the evolution of money has reshaped the global economy, and the real risks of a future where our transactions can be monitored and controlled in real time. We'll also discuss how Bitcoin stands as one of the last lines of defense against this growing control. But is there still time to act? And what can we do to protect our financial freedom? The American dream has always been a cornerstone of the United States identity. The idea that anyone, regardless of their background, could work hard, buy a house, raise a family, and build a stable life. In the 1950s and 60s, this dream was tangible for most people. With just one job, a middle-class family could own a home, support their children, and still plan for a secure retirement. But that reality has drastically changed in recent decades. To understand how we reached this point, it's crucial to look at the economic data. Since the 1970s, real wages in the United States have stagnated. According to the Pew Research Center, the average purchasing power of a worker in 2021 was nearly the same as in 1978. Meanwhile, the cost of living, especially for essentials like housing, healthcare, and education, has soared much faster than inflation. Buying a home, which used to be within reach for the middle class, has become an almost insurmountable challenge in many parts of the country. Cities like San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles have seen average home prices skyrocket to over $1 million. Student debt has also exploded. In 2023, total student debt in the United States surpassed $1.7 trillion. This financial burden is stifling younger generations, limiting their ability to buy homes, invest, and even start families. A study by the National Association of Realtors revealed that more than 50% of millennials who haven't purchased a home cite student debt as the main reason. These financial pressures are exacerbated by the growing income disparity. In 1980, the average CEO of a large American company earned 30 times the salary of a regular worker. Today, that gap has widened to over 320 times, according to the Economic Policy Institute. While working-class wages remain stagnant, wealth concentration among the top 1% continues to expand. In 2022, the richest 10% controlled about 70% of all wealth in the United States. This means a small financial elite dominates resources, while the majority faces an increasingly precarious reality. The 2008 financial crisis further deepened this inequality. In response to the crisis, the Federal Reserve injected trillions of dollars into the economy through quantitative easing and kept interest rates at historically low levels. While these policies stabilized financial markets, they also inflated asset prices like real estate and stocks, disproportionately benefiting the wealthy. For the middle class and workers, these assets became even more out of reach. This decline in economic mobility also affects younger generations' outlook on the future. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, less than half of millennials believe they will live better than their parents. This marks a stark reversal from the optimism that defined the post-war United States. For many, the American dream has been replaced by a constant struggle to pay bills and an uncertain future. To understand how we reach this point of wage stagnation, growing inequalities, and skyrocketing living costs, we need to examine the roots of the modern financial system. The next part of this analysis takes us back to the 1970s, when a historic decision forever changed how money works. We'll talk about the decoupling of the dollar from the gold standard and the consequences this shift brought to the global economy. To understand how the American economy reached a point of such inequality and instability, we need to travel back in time and explore the evolution of money. The dollar, as we know it today, wasn't always just paper. For much of modern history, the value of money was tied to gold. This system, known as the gold standard, imposed an important limitation. The government could only print as much money as it had gold to back it. This meant that the growth of the money supply was restricted, and as a result, inflation was kept in check. However, this system began to show signs of strain after World War II. The United States emerged as the world's largest economic power, and the dollar became the global reserve currency. This meant that other countries held large dollar reserves, trusting that those dollars could be exchanged for gold at any time. But as the American economy expanded and government spending increased, especially during the Vietnam War and the expansion of social programs, the balance between dollars in circulation and gold reserves became unsustainable. The breaking point came in 1971. In response to a growing run on gold and pressure on American reserves, President Richard Nixon announced the end of the dollar's convertibility into gold. With that, the dollar ceased to be backed by a tangible asset, becoming a fiat currency. In other words, its value was based solely on the trust that the government would keep its value stable. This decision, known as the Nixon shock, marked the beginning of a new era for the global financial system. From that moment on, the United States and the world entered a system where central banks could expand the money supply without limits. Initially, this change didn't seem drastic, but as decades passed, the effects became evident. Inflation began to slowly erode the purchasing power of the population. A dollar from 1971 is worth less than 15 cents today in terms of purchasing power. What does this mean in practice? It means that over time, wages that didn't keep up with inflation led to a constant decline in the quality of life for millions of Americans. This transition to unbacked money also paved the way for repeated cycles of financial bubbles. In the 2000s, we saw the housing bubble, driven by cheap credit and loose monetary policies. When that bubble burst in 2008, the Federal Reserve responded by printing trillions of dollars to save banks and stimulate the economy. While this avoided an immediate collapse, it also laid the groundwork for the growing inequality we discussed earlier. As asset prices soared, the average worker, with limited access to stocks or real estate, became poorer in relative terms. The shift to the fiat system also allowed governments to finance growing deficits without facing the immediate consequences of a currency limited by gold. In 2023, the U.S. national debt exceeded $32 trillion, more than the country's annual GDP. Printing money and increasing debt are short-term solutions that come with long-term costs: persistent inflation, loss of confidence in the currency, and the need for ever lower interest rates to sustain growth. Now we face a new phase in this evolution of money: the potential introduction of digital currencies issued by central banks. But unlike physical money or traditional fiat currencies, these new currencies come with an unprecedented level of control and surveillance. In the next topic, we'll explore how programmable digital currencies could represent the greatest threat to financial freedom we've ever seen. As money evolves into the digital realm, we enter a new phase with the potential to profoundly transform the economy while simultaneously threatening financial freedom. In recent years, many governments and central banks worldwide have begun exploring and developing their own digital currencies, known as CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. At first glance, these currencies seem promising. They're fast, efficient, and can integrate more people into the financial system. But what's less discussed is the price we might pay in terms of privacy and freedom. To understand the impact of CBDCs, we need to compare what we have today with what's coming. In the current system, using physical cash and even digital transactions with cards or cryptocurrencies allows for some degree of anonymity. You can choose how, when, and where to spend your money without every transaction being tracked or controlled. But with programmable digital currencies, the situation changes entirely. With a CBDC, governments and central banks would have the power to monitor every financial movement in real time. This means they could, if they wanted, control how you spend your money, where it can be used, and even set limits on certain purchases. Let's see how this could work in practice. Imagine the US government implements a CBDC to replace physical dollars. They could program this currency to ensure that certain economic stimulus funds are spent in specific categories. For example, during an economic crisis, the government might distribute digital money, but with the condition that it can only be spent on food or essential needs and within a limited period. While this application seems reasonable in emergency scenarios, it sets dangerous precedents for absolute control over the population's consumption. And the control doesn't stop there. In a programmable digital currency system, the government could easily block or limit transactions by individuals or groups deemed problematic. Imagine having your access to money cut off for participating in protests or supporting political causes that challenge the status quo. This is not fiction. In China, for example, the social credit system already integrates digital and financial behavior, and the country is developing its own digital currency with the potential to amplify this control. Now think about the United States and other developed democracies. While significant protections against such abuses exist today, centralizing finances in a government-issued digital currency could make creating similar mechanisms easier, even if subtly at first. In a future where all money is digital and programmable, financial choices could be directed by algorithms or government policies, limiting individual freedom and privacy. A simple example: a government could decide that you cannot spend more than a certain amount on entertainment or travel if you've already reached an acceptable limit of carbon emissions for the year, justifying it as an environmental measure. In developed countries like Canada, we've seen examples of how financial control can be used to silence dissent. During the 2022 trucker protests, the Canadian government froze bank accounts of protesters and supporters, using its power over the financial system as a form of repression. Now imagine how easily this could be implemented in a completely digital and centralized system. Meanwhile, the alternative offered by decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin counters this trend toward control. Bitcoin, for example, is censorship-resistant since no one can block or reverse a transaction. This gives people the ability to maintain their financial freedom out of the reach of governments and corporations. But the question we need to ask is, how much of this freedom will be preserved as governments push forward with implementing centralized digital currencies? These issues bring us to the final point: the role of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in protecting financial freedom in a world where control over money is becoming increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few. Faced with the growing threat of centralized and programmable digital currencies, Bitcoin emerges as a powerful alternative for those seeking to preserve their financial freedom. But what exactly makes Bitcoin such a unique solution? And why is it seen by many as a form of resistance against government control and the loss of autonomy over one's own money? To begin with, Bitcoin was created in 2009 by an anonymous figure known as Satoshi Nakamoto, shortly after the global financial crisis of 2008. That crisis exposed the fundamental flaws of the traditional banking system and the vulnerability of global economies to political decisions. Bitcoin was designed as a response to this, a decentralized monetary system that doesn't rely on any government or financial institution to function. Unlike fiat currencies, whose supply can be endlessly increased by central banks, Bitcoin has a fixed limit. Only 21 million units will ever be created. This makes it immune to the uncontrolled inflation that has eroded the dollar's value since the gold standard was abandoned. This feature is one of Bitcoin's biggest attractions as a store of value. To understand its impact, consider this. Since 2009, Bitcoin's price has risen from a few cents to tens of thousands of dollars. Despite its volatility, long-term growth has been impressive. In 2021, Bitcoin's price exceeded $60,000, and even after significant corrections, it remains one of the best-performing asset classes of the past decade. Many investors view it as digital gold, a scarce, censorship-resistant asset that can preserve value in times of instability. Furthermore, Bitcoin is censorship-resistant. In a world where governments can easily freeze bank accounts and restrict transactions, Bitcoin offers a way to transfer and store value without external interference. A recent example occurred during the economic crisis in Nigeria, where the government imposed severe restrictions on bank withdrawals. Many Nigerians turned to Bitcoin to bypass these limitations and preserve their finances. Another emblematic case is that of citizens in Venezuela, where hyperinflation devastated the local currency. In these contexts, Bitcoin has become a safe haven for those needing to escape collapsing economies. In the United States and other developed economies, Interest in Bitcoin is growing precisely because of this protection against centralized control. With the introduction of government-issued digital currencies, potentially bringing new levels of monitoring and restriction, Bitcoin offers a way to maintain privacy and autonomy over one's money. Of course, it's not perfect. Its volatility remains a significant challenge. Sharp price fluctuations make it difficult to use as everyday currency, and many critics argue that it doesn't replace the dollar for daily transactions. However, as a means of preserving value and resisting censorship, its impact cannot be ignored. A recent example of Bitcoin's growing acceptance is the decision of companies like Tesla and MicroStrategy to add Bitcoin to their balance sheets. This signals that, for major market players, Bitcoin is not just an experimental digital currency, but a strategic asset. Additionally, countries like El Salvador have adopted Bitcoin as an official currency, showing how it can play a central role in emerging economies seeking alternatives to the dollar. It's important to highlight that Bitcoin's long-term success still depends on several factors. Issues like regulation, technological advancements, and widespread acceptance are still in play. In the United States, for example, there's an intense debate on how to regulate cryptocurrencies without compromising their decentralized essence. While the government seeks greater oversight to prevent fraud and money laundering, Bitcoin advocates warn of the dangers of regulations that could stifle innovation and undermine financial freedom. As the world moves closer to an increasingly digitalized economy, the debate about the future of money intensifies. For some, Bitcoin represents a vital line of defense against financial authoritarianism and the erosion of freedom. For others, it's just a speculative bubble destined to fail. Regardless of where you stand, one thing is certain. Bitcoin is not just a digital currency. It symbolizes a larger struggle for autonomy, resistance to centralization, and the preservation of rights in a world that is rapidly changing. The economy is changing rapidly, and with it, the way we live and relate to money. For many, the future seems bleak. Opportunities are dwindling, and control over our financial choices is becoming increasingly restricted. The introduction of government-issued digital currencies could represent the end of the privacy and financial autonomy we once took for granted. However, there is still hope. Bitcoin and other decentralized cryptocurrencies offer an alternative, a way to preserve value and exercise financial freedom in an increasingly centralized world. But this alternative comes with risks, such as volatility and uncertain regulation. The question we all need to consider is, are we willing to take those risks in the name of freedom? Financial freedom, like any other form of freedom, is not guaranteed. It needs to be defended and preserved. Time is running out, and the choices we make now will determine whether we live in a future of opportunities or in a world where our lives are monitored and controlled down to the last penny. The decision is ours, and the time to act is now.